So I thought what we would do, Eric and I thought what we'd do is start with just sort of a little orientation to what the story is, assuming that naturally many have not probably had a chance to read it. And I have as an advantage here a kind of a nut graph, and which was a real point of contention in the editing, because I hate nut graphs. It's always a point of contention, and I'm always sort of saying, why does the reader need to know? And I don't, it's an odd thing for a journalist to say. But so Eric prevailed upon me to write a nut graph, and so now I'm lucky enough because I have this nut graph to sort of explain what the story is. And I think he was very right that it did end up giving us the sort of the freedom to do the kind of wandering that I wanted to do. So this is what the story is about. I went to Moscow and St. Petersburg for 2 weeks in November because the Olympics were coming to Russia. And for a brief moment, it seemed possible that the outside world was interested in the unraveling of civil society in one of the most powerful countries on the globe. Books are being banned, Burroughs and Baudelaire and Huxley's Brave New World. Immigrants hunted, journalists killed, a riot girl band, Pussy Riot, imprisoned for almost 2 years for playing a punk prayer in a Moscow cathedral. Blasphemy is now illegal. Civil society isn't just coming undone, it's imploding. I wanted to visit the bottom of the heap, the Golubai, the blues, which in Russia is another word for queer, any way of being other than Russian, which under President Putin has become a kind of sexual orientation. I wanted to see what ordinary LGBT life was like in a nation whose leaders have decided that homosexualism, it's a term they use, is a threat to its sexual sovereignty, also a term in usage, that genderless tolerance, in Putin's word, is a disease of the West that Russia will cure. The medicine is that of traditional values, a phrase, ironically, imported from the West, grafted onto a deeply conformist strain of nationalism. In Russia, that means silence and violence, censorship, and in its shadow, much worse. So that's the nut graph. That's what I was going to find out about. And we, as we'll talk about, we did this story in this very sort of speedy time frame, and we didn't really know, we didn't have some of that knowledge that you have when you go into a story. This is who it's going to be about. We just had this sense of this growing terror in Russia, and that we had to move quickly because we wanted the story to come out in time for the Olympics, which meant getting it in an issue just a couple months away. So to give you a sense of how we pursued that, went to these two cities and wandered around and talked to all sorts of people, and then sort of wrote the story, and as a sort of smaller than a nut graph, these vignettes that we ended up sort of interspersing through the piece that I'd originally written as scenes, and then for space we were going to cut them, but I said if we cut them, we'll only have heroes and villains, and in fact the reality of gay life in Russia right now is much darker. And so this is a short little scene. These vignettes, these sort of countercurrents to the story. These were characters that would be introduced and then they would just disappear. They would be sort of a different kind of nut graph throughout. At a club called Ice, I befriend a long-necked hustler with bright green eyes, wearing a white NYPD cap. His name is Nikolai. He says he kissed his first boy at 14, but that it took him until he was 17 to realize he was gay. He was small in school and he fought often, but he was perhaps a little slow to grasp his social condition. He didn't understand why other boys beat him. By the time he got it, he'd learned how to beat them. Such was his coming out story. He was happy being gay, though. He liked knowing what he wanted. The problem was his mother. Gay she could handle, but she wanted grandkids. She made him a deal, an apartment in exchange for grandchildren, plural, minimum 2. So Nikolai did what he had to do. I married a woman. I'm a father. He beams. He has delivered the goods. A girl, 1.5 years old, a boy, 4 months. His mother rewarded him with the apartment, and he came out to his wife. I don't think there's homophobia in Russia, he says, because I always carry a gun. The logic takes me a moment. He means that they can't hurt him, because he will hurt them first. His father, a criminal, he says, found Nikolai on a Grindr-like app once. He said he was coming to kill Nikolai. Nikolai wrote back, I'm waiting for you. His father never came. Nikolai is waiting. He taps one side of his head and then the other to show the path of the bullet he will put through his father's skull. So that gives you sort of the frame of the story. now maybe Eric will pick up on how we got to that point.
Yeah, so we will talk a little bit about how we ended up coming up with that vignette structure that Jeff was talking about. But to back up and get into the generation of the story idea itself, at the time I first contacted Jeff, as Madison said, I was the assistant to the editor-in-chief at GQ, which is like, if you guys have seen like The Devil Wears Prada, it's literally that job. And so I was trying to prove myself editorially as much as I could, pitching small ideas here and there, but I knew I needed to make a big move. And in order to do so, I needed to find a great writer that GQ hadn't worked with before. So this was sort of our coming out for both for at GQ. So
no guns involved. It was very sweet.
It's like it was the first time that I'd produced something really big for the magazine. It was the first time that Jeff had written for the magazine. So our initial idea, it was an idea that I had to write a takedown of this televangelist, Peter Popov. I still think it's a great story, and one of you guys should absolutely report on it. But this televangelist who had fallen from grace and had come back again and is sort of just milking poor, unfortunate people for every dime they have. And I came up with this idea to do a story on him, and just trying to think about which writer I wanted to assign it to, I came across Jeff, whose work I was familiar with, but after digging in, I sort of realized that he was an expert on these subcultures, these religious subcultures in the US. I reached out to him cold, I just emailed his Dartmouth email, and I asked, "Are you doing magazine stories?" And he responded, he said, "Only the ones that I love." So I pitched the idea.
Like such a prima donna.
Jeff, you are a bit
yes,
of a...
yeah.
No, I'm kidding, but he's not. So I pitched this idea to do this televangelist takedown, and Jeff was into the idea. The problem was that Jim Nelson, the editor-in-chief at GQ, was not into the idea. He really didn't like it. So we went back to the drawing board, and Jeff began pitching ideas to me, ideas that had been kicking around in your head. Not terrible ideas. No, they were not terrible ideas, but they were not the right fit
no
for
to
GQ.
all of them. Like,
I did say no to all of them.
And so this was, and I think this is sort of an interesting thing, because I've never been very good at figuring out the stories that magazines will like. And so I depend on editors. An editor like Eric, who came to me with that Peter Popov story, and knew that I'd been writing about sort of evangelical subcultures and sort of the line between truth and fraudulence and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, oh, this is a person who's read my work, and so he's coming to me with an idea that seems relevant to me. And that is a sign this is a good editor to work with, as opposed to an editor a little while ago came to me with an idea about campaign finance reform, and I was just sort of insulted. I'm like, you don't know me. I don't want to write. Why would I want to write? It's not, I'm sure some of you are sitting there and said, that's great, I want that, but it wasn't for me. And so then the editor sort of sometimes knows what a good story for you is better than you. So I came back with a story. I said, well, okay, that doesn't work. I've got a great one. There's a guy up the road from me here in Vermont who he lives with bears. And I was like thinking of Grizzly Adams and the Bear Man, and I thought, this is perfect. It's a GQ story. There's a man in it. There's bears. I was like, and I've tried this on a number of magazines. And I'm like, no. Ben Killam, and there's a National Geographic documentary about him. So I was right, and all the magazines are wrong. But that wasn't going to work. And then I was like, oh, I've got another perfect story. These men in this interesting prison college program at Sing Sing. And that didn't work, and then I thought I'd come across in Kenya this secret sort of gay men's center. Homosexuality is illegal in Kenya, and it's actually being funded by the US government, although the US government doesn't know that. And I thought this was perfect, and all wrong. So,
and not that they were bad ideas, they're great ideas. They just weren't quite the right fit for us, and like Jeff was saying, that's something really important when coming up with an idea that I can bring to my boss and say, are you interested in this? I need to think, what is a good story for the magazine itself? So cut to 3 months later, basically in early September at a story ideas meeting at the magazine, and this is in 2013, we we're talking about the crackdown on gay culture in Russia and the lead up to the Olympics. And at this point, you're planning a magazine anywhere from 3 to 6 months in advance. And so we're 6 months out for the Olympics, about 5 months. And so immediately a light bulb went off in my head, because at this point I was trying to figure out a story idea for Jeff, and I really wanted to make this work. Like I said, it's sort of my first big piece for the magazine. And this light bulb went off. I remembered this piece that Jeff had written for Harper's, I believe in 2008, I want to say. It could have been earlier.
Uganda, you're talking about Uganda?
Yeah.
Yeah, 2010. Yeah.
2010. So it was a piece about the crackdown on gay culture in Uganda. And I thought, and in the meeting I said, what about Jeff Sharlet for the story? And Jim Nelson, the editor-in-chief, was familiar with that piece and said, absolutely, if Jeff is into the idea, we will greenlight it. So, it was sort of the opposite situation with Peter Popov. With that situation, Jeff and I were on board, and I needed to convince Jim, and Jim wasn't into it. In this situation, Jim and I were both on board with Jeff doing it, and I needed to convince Jeff to do it. So I sent this idea, and we were looking back through emails, and it was just sort of like this long chain of rejected ideas. And then at the top of which I said to email Jeff, and I said, what about this crackdown on gay culture in Russia? Not that you're the crackdown on gay culture guy, but and then Jeff said yes, and that's where we really began in earnest working on the piece.
I said I'd be glad to be the writing about crackdown on gay culture guy, but I mean, partly because I think the issues were important, but also because I think that Eric was recognizing the kind of story that I like to do, which you go to it's very obvious, people in a place. You go to a place and you wander around, and you don't necessarily have, the clear drama of there's been a heist, what happened, or there's been a murder, that kind of arc, which I love reading those stories, but I'm not very good at writing them, and maybe because they don't sort of give me the space that I need to sort of think a thing through and find out what it is. So this was a story that was sort of picking up on that, much like the Uganda story, where I did have a clear bad guy, this guy who wrote a law called the Kill the Gays Bill, very subtle, and had invited me over because he thought he could persuade me. He said, if you just come, if you see it for yourself, you'll agree. Genocide is a way to go. But I ended up just sort of wandering around and talking to all these sort of people who were experiencing this on all sides of the aspects of the subject. And in Moscow, and St. Petersburg, this was a story that would allow me to do that as well. Although we did have, in the beginning, more of a focus on a guy called Machete, who at the time was running something called Occupy Pedophilia, where they would go and they would hunt down young gay men and then torture them, and then release the videos onto YouTube. And these became very popular. At one point, one of these torture videos was the most popular video in Russia. So at first we thought, well, obviously, if we can get close to this guy, this horrible guy, Machete, but Machete had already fled by the time I got there. The Russian government, that was sort of like just a little bit too much. That's a little bit too far. There's a right way to hunt and harass people, and then there's a tacky way. And Machete was tacky, and that sort of left this sort of open space for a different kind of reporting, and I would say there's all sorts of different ways that writers work with editors, and I think one of Eric's really great virtues as an editor was his sort of willingness to listen to me go on for a long time about whatever was, I would come back at 3 in the morning from my reporting and would type up long just sort of dispatches to Eric. Or I remember, calling you. I had just come from meeting this guy, the guy with the leather hat, who shot out the eye of that guy. This guy's name is Timur Ayasev. And sort of actually one of the really sort of lucky reporting coups. I knew he was a guy who stalks and harasses gay people and tries to get them fired from their jobs. He was very proud of this. He wanted to boast about it. And he had a tablet and he was showing me, his greatest hits, so to speak. And I had already met Dima, the man who'd been shot and so on. And I knew that he'd been shot with an air gun. And he's flipping through, Timur is flipping through his his pictures and so on, and then he accidentally shows me a picture of a brand new air gun that he's bought. And he's like, oh, no, that's for my son. And I'm like, and then you also have blueprints of the building where Dima was shot. You have surveillance video of it. And he says, yeah, I was just curious. So, you know, I would be then writing Eric or calling Eric and say, this is happening, and sort of thinking through the story as we went, which became essential because we had such a short amount of time that you knew all the pieces. You knew Timur, and you knew Dima, you knew Elena Kostyachenko, this woman here, who was a journalist herself, and had been beaten so many times. And she was leading these kiss-ins in front of the Duma, where gay men and lesbian women would go and kiss, and they would be attacked, first with rocks and eggs, and then finally, most horrifically, the anti-gay activists brought their children, and their children attacked. Really, you know, a mob of 12-year-old boys can do a lot of damage, with the understanding that none of the activists could hit back. The police were there, ready to arrest the activists. And so a kid is beating on you, and if you push him, suddenly you are guilty of assaulting a child. So I would come back with each of these stories, and then I would call Eric, and so we started to have a populated universe of the story, even though we had no shape. And I don't know what you were thinking at the end. You might, or you might. This is all very interesting, but where is the arc? Because there was no arc at that point.
Right, and I think that that's one thing that's particularly unique about this story is that we went into it without a natural arc in the piece, and Jeff went to report without having a ton of sources lined up and hit the ground running. You know, sort of we set up a time for you to go, and I think we booked a plane back again maybe 10 days later, and we knew that you were going to go to Moscow and St. Petersburg, but after that you were on your own. And so that's why these dispatches became so important, these daily, nightly updates that Jeff would send to me, just so I was aware of what he was reporting on and we could begin formulating a story. Because what effectively ended up happening during the writing phase is that you had about 2.5 weeks to craft what ended up being the first draft at around 12,000 words, 11,000, 12,000 words. Very short amount of time to write, to transcribe all the material, sift through it, and then craft something that closely approximated a magazine story. So these dispatches became a way for me to be aware of what was going on in Jeff's reporting. So then cut to the writing phase, you bunker down and write. And I think at that point we had largely not been communicating during the actual 2.5-week writing phase. But then once sections began sort of wrapping up a little, you began sending those to me as well. So it's not as though I got a full, complete draft. You know, at one big chunk, I began receiving these sections that Jeff was writing. And this, at the time, served mostly because we were operating on such a short schedule. You know, Jeff had about 2.5 weeks to write, and then we had about 2 weeks to edit the piece. And so as I was getting the chunks in, I didn't know what the whole piece was going to look like, but I could begin sifting through and figuring out what paragraphs were working, what sentences were working, how I wanted the language to change. But at that point, we hadn't really dug into the piece together, right? So I was sort of editing on my own as Jeff was completing all of the sections. And so then I think it was the week of December 16th that we had a complete draft, which was about a week before the story was to ship off to the publisher.
And the complete draft, and I felt very proud because I had, so this is my first story with GQ. I can't be a jerk and just hand in tons and tons of words. 11,000 words seems about right. The story had been assigned at 5, but I was like, that's not, that doesn't mean anything. And I have to admit, sort of I had an incomplete understanding of the magazine because I read the writers that I love in it, like Mike Paternini and John Sullivan and Amy Wallace, who was here, and all these wonderful writers, and I don't sort of see the whole magazine. And I remember I said, okay, I've got it down to 11,000. And had written in that period, and you're right, I'm glad you reminded me that we didn't really talk, because that sort of reminds me that for me in a writing, that's sort of when before I show the editor anything is when I start getting preemptively angry at them. And it really helps me write. I'm like, God damn, I'm gonna show them. And and they're going to keep it, but I'll be right. But then I calmed down. And I said 11,000 words. He's like, oh well, this has to be. Maybe we could stretch it to 6, and that was horrifying.
And that was our first fight. We had 2 fights during this week-long period.
One authentic and one strategic.
Yeah. The first.
They probably felt both authentic to you.
Felt very real to me. Yeah. The first fight was when I took that 11,000-word draft and overnight transformed it into a 6,000-word piece, and Jeff panicked when he saw that. Really, really did not like. I mean, screaming at me, and rightfully so.
I like to say yelling. It has more dignity.
Yeah, not screaming so much, but yeah.
With gravitas.
No, we actually did not meet until the National Magazine Awards. Our whole relationship was built over the phone. Yeah. Jeff is.
It would have been harder to yell if I had met him. Nice.
Yeah. So that was, and this was again, I think, a function really of how short a time we had to edit this thing. If we had a longer period of time to go back and forth on the changes that I wanted to make, if we had even 2 weeks as opposed to 1 week, something like an 11,000 word down to a 6,000 word draft would have been a series of conversations.
There would have been time for you to read it and say, this, here's what we could do, and for me to think about it, and for me to sort of steam privately and then come back to it, which is, a lot of the editing process is sort of processing your anger and emotions. But it was sort of instant, and, I had been, because it was so compressed, and I'm a really slow writer, and I'd written really fast, and I'd been sort of up all night. I also had a brand new baby. And that wasn't sort of making things easy. And then there was these stories, this compilation of these people. I think we have about 12 characters in the story, and that's probably a sort of a 4-to-1 or 5-to-1 ratio. The sort of the people I met and talked, and sort of became. One of the things that was interesting was I met one gay person in Russia who had not been beaten. Everyone else had been beaten at some point, and it wasn't even a point of discussion. The badge of the gay, as one man put it, pointing to his broken nose, and the guys around him all laugh and point to their broken noses. And so I felt like this was something that was not, as writers often do, this is not part of, there was a sort of an international story now about Russia's crackdown on gay life, but that wasn't really part of it, the ordinariness of it, not the sort of the extraordinary and looking at the politics of Putin. And we had agreed together that we were not going to go and talk to the politicians. I talked to one politician, the one member of the Duma who did not vote for the anti-gay law. He didn't vote against it, he just didn't vote for it. He was no great hero. And otherwise, so I thought this ordinariness was really important. And so I did lose my temper, and thought, I'll just withdraw the story. That's probably best, except that faster and louder. And you handled it very well, so you should.
Well, thank you. So what the solution that we came up with, though, so what happened in that brutal edit was that I had removed a lot of these characters that ended up becoming these vignettes. And what Jeff helped me realize through that conversation, where you very passionately argued your case, was that what I had effectively done was turned a story that had a lot of characters that had a lot of complexity. I reduced down to a story about heroes and villains with little in between. And so what ended up becoming these vignettes really layered in this notion that not all gays in Russia are heroes. In fact, some of them aren't concerned at all about the crackdown. And also sort of not all of the evil guys are so evil. Well, I guess all the evil guys are very evil.
They were pretty astonishingly evil. I mean,
Jeff had a gun pointed at him at one point during the reporting.
By a Cossack. For those of you who know, some people like a Cossack, and then other people like Cossacks still exist, and yes, they do. And I actually, they dress like Cossacks and Fiddler on the Roof. They're now deputized. Putin has actually created these paramilitary forces across the country because, as one governor of one region says, the Cossacks can do what the police can't do. And the police are no sweet peas themselves. So what the Cossacks can do is they carry guns illegally. They carry these these whips with a heavy sort of metal block, a sharp metal block at the end. and they carry big knives, and they see themselves as fighting a holy war against gay men. So yeah, we had some really, really uncommonly bad guys, and they also sort of took pleasure and delight in describing the violence that they had committed. And at one point, one of my translators and we had gone for what we thought was a meeting with one kind of bad guy character, and it then sort of turned into, was way on the outskirts of St. Petersburg, like this abandoned industrial park, like just great body dumping territory. And it turned out to be sort of a meeting of like the League of Evil Super Friends, because there was the Cossacks, there was these very angry babushkas, there were these the right-wing branch of the Russian Orthodox Church, there's the Russian equivalent of paratroopers, which have no parallel here. I mean, the paratroopers in Russia is sort of it's an ethnic branch of the military, and when they have National Paratrooper Day, everyone hides inside. And they were all there, and again, with the tablet saying, look, and what they're doing is showing bloody faces, and at this point they're showing the bloody faces of a lot of the activists that I've been spending weeks with, including, what they don't know is the woman who's sitting next to me, the translator, who had been whipped by a Cossack, and, or stoned, I'm sorry. We're just sitting there, if they get to her face and then suddenly realize what this is about, we're really in terrible trouble. And the Cossack pointed a gun, but he thought it was like a joke. It wasn't like, I'm going to shoot you. It was like, I could shoot you, haha. So we had these villains, and then we had these great heroes, like Elena Kostyachenko, this woman that you saw her on the screen, who would do these kiss-ins and get terribly beaten, and then they get back up, and they do it again. And they get beaten down, and they just get back up, and they do it again. I mean, just like courage, like you couldn't believe. But there was this territory in between, and that's what we were fighting about. And I think you came up with the idea of the vignettes, of putting them back as vignettes, right?
Right. I mean, because rather than lose them wholesale, we incorporated them in this somewhat non-traditional way, and it just ended up making the piece, instantly better in a way that we both. I think that the moment where the story really clicked for both of us is when the vignettes were added back in, and this is 3 days before it's being sent off to the publisher. I'm sorry, the printer. I mean, this was like really up to the last second. We were figuring out just the basic structure of the piece, let alone line editing it.
And I had really resigned myself at that point, and I was just telling, all right, I'm just going to get a payday. I don't care. And they're going to go ahead, and they're going to, I thought they were going to sort of reproduce a certain kind of, just that hero narrative, and it doesn't show what, things like this do. They don't make everybody better. Elena Kostyachenko becomes brave, but most people, oppression can really it can crush you and break you. And I met all sorts of people who were terrified, people who were, lots of people going in. If everyone was sort of making plans to get out of the country if they could, if they had the means and so on. That's a difficult story, right? Because you want to show the good guys. In this case, the good guys are LGBT Russians as heroic. And if though we had done as I wanted with these sort of long scenes in between, I think it would have lost its shape. But that gave it, what your idea of the vignette sort of gave it a more distinctive, like, okay, here's a countercurrent. We are mainly focusing on heroes and villains, but then there's this sort of thread running through it that's making us see those heroes and villains in a different light. And I think that saved it. Mm-hmm. Although we had a fight about that too. That was the strategic fight.
The strategic fight, right.
But it did not feel strategic to you.
It just felt like a fight.
Yes, okay. So at this point, I had discovered, I didn't know when Eric had assigned this story that you were working at that time as assistant to the editor. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh, great, GQ wants me to do a story, that's wonderful. And then I was like, wait a minute, does your boss even know that you're doing this? Is this like for your zine or something? Is this actually gonna happen?
And I remember actually during those those heated discussions that we had, I was at the time sitting outside of Jim Nelson's office, and he's in there holding meetings or conducting whatever business he's conducting, and I'm sitting there like trying to fight with Jeff into the phone, like, Jeff, God, you know what I mean? Like I didn't want him to hear the fight, and then Jim would come out and be like, tough conversation, huh? So Jim was sort of aware of what was going on, but
so actually that's the strategic one. So the second fight, I actually didn't lose my temper. I thought that. I said, look, because then Jim like, no, we don't have room. We got to take out the vignettes. after we'd agreed on the vignettes. Everyone liked the vignettes and like, but we just don't have room. Well, we have to take them out. And you had sort of made a case for it, and you're like, no, I can't go back, I can't fight it. And I'm like, no, you gotta, you know. I thought that, you know, if I put you in the difficult place of being between me, a difficult writer, and Jim, your boss, that you might go back in and fight more if I threatened to withdraw the story again.
Yeah.
So it was strategic, and I wasn't really going to do it. And now that I know that Jim was sort of overhearing these sort of conversations, maybe he had more sympathy for you. So maybe it worked. I don't know. But anyway, you went back and you fought, and you got it.
Yeah, we got it. Yeah. And you know, there were other issues that came up that we disagreed on. Like the lead was one big issue for us. So we had this lead that, you know, Jeff is all about the non-traditional lead, and just, you know, magazines have this.
Every magazine writer thinks they're gonna, I'm gonna break the formula, but we never do.
Every writer I work with feels as though they're gonna reinvent the lead every time, and then I have to tell them that no, in fact, we need a traditional lead. And so, so that was one. I mean, and then in the end, I think you're happy with it.
No, I'm very happy. I'm very happy. So the lead was, I had decided the perfect lead. I had met I met this one guy, and he was part of two couples, heterosexual couples. They were best friends. They lived next door. They each had kids. They were very successful people in life. Everything was just a wonderful life. And what nobody knew, and they had really told nobody until this guy decided to tell me, because I think they'd been living with a secret. They were actually, it was the two men were a couple and the two women were a couple. And they lived to the world, and then there was a door between their apartments, and at night they would sort of switch bedrooms. I mean, literally, there's no pictures in either apartment that would give this away. And I thought, this is perfect. And so what I'll do is I'll have a 2,000-word lead about ordinary, just like Russian Ozzie and Harriet. And it'll be so boring that you'll just like see the ordinariness of it. And Jim didn't think that was a good idea, and he thought, and Eric didn't think it was a good idea. And there's the gun. There's a gun, and you know, if you have a gun in a story, maybe you should put it up front. And I thought, that's so obvious. That's so interesting. You know, why would we want to do that? But yeah, you were absolutely right, because I don't think the story would have been read with my beautiful 2,000-word Ozzie and Harriet, Russian Ozzie and Harriet lead. And I think a lot of people read it because the gun, and I think it's worth, you know, there's a collaboration between us, but the collaboration between the reader, that's what those formulas are for. They're not for crushing the story, they're for signaling to readers that something's going to happen here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What we'd like to do now is open this up for some questions. And we're live streaming, so if you have a question, we're going to walk around with a mic so people who are outside of this room can hear us. So anybody have one to begin with?
Hi, Jeff. I wondered how initially, since you had so little time and you went into this without a story arc for a really long time, how in 2 weeks did you even organize your material and get it down to your initial 1,200 words?
I did not organize my material. I had the advantage of having done this other reporting on the crackdown in Uganda and so on, so I knew some sort of the international activists who put me in touch with activists on the ground. I hired as a translator an activist, which some people would look very askance at, but I knew there was no way people were going to trust me. I mean, there was no incentive for people to sort of talk to any kind of reporter. And I also knew I didn't want to talk to activists. I'm not particularly interested in activists. Their job is to sort of deliver a message versus lives. And so I just got there and said, let's just start talking to as many people as possible. Eric had tasked me, he said that I had to go to clubs. And that was by far and away the most terrifying thing I'd ever done as a reporter. Because I mean, look at me, I was like, how am I going to get into clubs? And in fact, there was one really interesting club that one of the men I met says, don't try. But everywhere else I could, and that was sort of like a measure of in some ways, the smallness of LGBT life in Russia. That, you know, anyone was welcome. Anyone who was willing to go to these spaces was welcome. But also, I think you sort of rightly knew that you say you're from GQ, and it's sort of like, it's like GQ goggles. They imagine that you're much better looking and better dressed than you are. I mean, this is a story we just did, and someone who didn't like it said, and Sharlet came in his GQ finery. Exactly what I am wearing right now. I got these jeans at LL Bean. This is from a Hanover, New Hampshire men's shop. It's rural, small town. So I was just sort of wandering and being disorganized as I am in your answer, and just piling the stuff up. That was my goal, is always just to pile stuff up and sleep as little as possible, and then get home, and then you start spreading it out on the floor and looking at it. And I think young reporters can sometimes, maybe teachers don't want me to say this, I think young reporters can sometimes be too concerned about sort of organizing their research. I think the more important thing is to organize your thinking after you've done the reporting.
Right behind you.
This is potentially less interesting, and it's more practical, just about the magazine itself. But if you have a piece that needs to be 6,000 words, and then 3 days before it goes to the publisher, it's kind of mutating back to 11,000. What does that, what kind of crazy conversations are you having in terms of adding things or cutting space down, or does that, in terms of, does that sort of throw the rest of the magazine into a tailspin when you have a feature that has not been necessarily an agreed upon length?
Well, the story is always assigned at a certain length that, and Jim decides that. The editor-in-chief of any publication is the one to say, okay, this is what I'm willing to run the story at, and I'm not guaranteeing any longer length. So, when it comes to the editing process, we're well aware of that. And so we know, actually the story was assigned to 5,000 words, and you aspirationally hope that you'll turn in a draft to the editor that he'll be so blown away by that he'll give you the entire feature well to run it, and you can run a 25,000 word story. But in fact, you need to turn in a draft that is somewhere probably, I think that the first draft we turned in was around 8,000 words or so, but we knew that we needed to bring it down within the length, approximately what Jim was expecting, because you don't have any other choice. That's the space he's going to give you, regardless of how good the story is. And so, there's not really an opportunity to allow it to balloon back up to 11,000 words. You know that you need to work within the parameters. What's more difficult is when, and this actually often happens, you perfectly craft this narrative and you feel really strongly about it. This actually happened with the last piece that we did, the men's rights movement story. This is 2 days before, actually probably the day before we need to ship it off. We find out that we need to take it from 6,000 down to 5,000 words. And at this point, we've worked on this story for 3 months, and we have this very tight narrative that we're all proud with, including Jim Nelson. And all of a sudden, we just need to lose a sixth of it. And so that often happens, and you just sort of get used to it. You sort of have to kill your darlings and hope that the story doesn't get too screwed up.
But in terms of a practical thing, I think it is worth knowing. So I make the joke that I handed in at 11,000, and I think I'm being very good. And that's actually not crazy, because I have lots of friends who you may have, in fact, I know you're having this, you've got someone who says he's got 70,000 words or something like this. Yep. There's people who hand in a lot, and I think the line that the writer wants to understand is that by handing in more, you are negotiating for more space. So the story ended up running at, I think, 8,000, right? Is the final? 7,500, yeah. And if you do want that more space, you have to put stuff on the page that wouldn't this be good to include? And it's a little bit of a fine line. If you go crazy, they're just going to say, forget it, we can't do this. How much more can you go over in terms of, it's not even so much what you're showing as a story. If you're deluded and you think they're going to just sort of say yes and would now kill every other story to make room for yours, really it's more like you're showing possible stories with that 11,000 word story. So I think young writers should do that. You should know that you can go over and the editors will expect it.
Kind of building off of that one, when you have extra content like this, or extra, is there the possibility of kind of having a director's cut version available to the public, putting something online?
Yeah, we that was actually something that I was able to sort of reassure Jeff with, was that, don't worry, we can always run the draft that you want online, which we ended up not doing, because what ends up happening is the final version that you come up with that runs in the magazine really is, I mean, in this case, it was a very tight story that we were both very proud of. And to add back in text at that, just for the online version, I think would have been just sort of padding it out with unnecessary material. However, Jeff, once he gets the story back after 60 days, the story goes back to the writer. It's no longer the magazine solely. The rights go back to Jeff, and Jeff can publish it in a book. I think that you've talked about expanding the piece into something closer to what you originally had hoped it would be.
Well, that's what I've always done. I've always sort of, I think early on in my writing life, there's a wonderful writer, died a little while ago, named Charles Bowden. And he would, in his acknowledgments, say, and thanks to these various magazines where I parked these stories for a while. And one that actually gave him a little more freedom in working with editors. If you know that you're going to use this in a book, and so you will have the director's cut, you can trust the editor, which despite, telling the sort of exciting stories of the fights, mainly I do trust Eric, because I know I'll have my say later. But also a lot of times, if I do that and give him the editor that space, I'm going to get all this incredible insight that I wouldn't have achieved. And then in a book where you don't have the same demand, so I probably will, if I do use this in a book, I probably will go back to that long Ozzie and Harriet opening, not just because now I get to do it my way, but because I'm not competing with Katy Perry, who was on the cover of it, and presumably people have picked up the book. Yes, that was a great story. Yeah.
And you went after it.
I did. I was nicely not saying. That's how we got the vignettes, actually. I said, you can't take 800 words out of Katy Perry. Sorry, I didn't know you then. It's good that I didn't know you, because I'm like, I can't do that to Amy. But yeah, so the director's cut, I'm not crazy about these sort of like longer versions online, because they're like, well, which one should I read? Which one do you care about? I am interested in the longer version that you might use in a book, whether it's a collection or a part of a larger project, in which there it really becomes more about further thinking, further reporting, post-publication.
And frankly, at the magazine, it's not just there's also a practical concern. By having a longer version, you're asking the copy department and the fact-checking department to do that much more work and go through these drafts, that they've already kind of gone through, and it's kind of doubling their work. And so, if you can do longer versions online, and we occasionally do, but it's asking a lot of the magazine staff.
Yeah. I actually am from Russia, and the magazine I worked for actually did a lot of coverage of gay life in Russia, so I have a kind of special relationship to this story. So, and when I was reading it, and I might be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, and especially because of these vignettes and this kind of brilliant structural decision, it struck me as that story kind of creates a picture of gay life in Russia, that there are these activists that are like fight for their rights, and and there are this kind of people that don't care and just want to have fun. Was it your intention to frame it like this? Do you think it's accurate, or what do you think?
I should say, I think one really important thing to understand about magazine stories, and it both relieves the writer of a certain burden and then makes you accountable in different ways. And I'm not a sociologist. I mean, my wife's a real historian, a real academic, and so I know what that work is. I don't try to do demographic surveys. The story that you're accountable for is, this is the experience you had. This person took you to that place, and so on. And as I said, I don't actually have the lineup. I did want to do, originally, if there had been time, I was like, why just the cities? This is great. GQ will fund me just to travel all over Russia. And when magazines get really flush again, as I'm sure will happen, I'll get that assignment. And I did want sort of that's part of why I wanted the Ozzie and Harriet beginning. Those were very ordinary people, had never been a part of anything political, just living their lives. And there are some of that. And the story, of course, closes with a woman who is an activist, but mainly just sort of living her life. It's a lesbian couple and their young son, and had they just had a beautiful story of how they had fallen in love and what they had done for each other. And this kid was just fantastic. and they were thinking about leaving and so on, and that became the natural ending to the story for me. And then, you know, these villains were not representative, right? Timur is not your average Russian. Well, I don't know. Maybe he is. That's terrible news. But they do sort of end up looming larger, and so then hopefully you put enough cues in the story to say, look, this is my subjective sort of account of this place. This is not. There's another way of understanding it. There's bigger picture stuff that if you care about this subject, you should read. But that's going to come from sociologists and political scientists and so on. My father is a Sovietologist. He was a political science, did his law degree at University of Moscow. So right from the beginning, I knew what I couldn't do, and he sort of warned me, don't try and say anything that you don't know about, boy. You know, so that limited me. Yeah.
Another question? I was wondering about the aftermath of the story. Have you heard anything from any of the sources or anybody else who have reacted to it in Russia?
Vladimir Putin is in hiding right now from the mighty
He's actually
GQ.
maybe in the audience
yes,
here.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, the aftermath is sort of interesting because here's a story that is probably actually could not affect, it's certainly not going to affect anything in Russia. Let's see, good things that came out of it. Zhenya Belyakov, who was my translator, was able to crowdfund an apartment because people saw this story, what he was doing. Elena Kostyachenko was beaten and arrested for singing the Russian national anthem and during the Olympics. And the one outcome that I'd hoped that we wanted it to be in time for the Olympics. We'd hoped that we would sort of shape the Olympic coverage a little bit more. And we did not, actually. NBC was pretty resolute in ignoring this issue and calling Putin a man of peace and so on. So I don't know. Maybe there's not much impact in that kind of immediate way.
For Eric, because this was your first big story for the magazine that you were working on, how did you learn how to pick your battles? And for Jeff, you as well, it was your first article you'd written for GQ. So between the two of you, it was a couple of firsts. How did you choose which battles to pick and how to go about doing that because you hadn't been in that situation before?
I actually think that, from my perspective, the short amount of time that we had to edit really helped me because I didn't even have time to second guess my intuition. So, you know, these conversations would just have to, you know, I would read a draft, make notes, and without even looking at them again, call Jeff. You know, we just didn't even have the time to really sort of go back and forth. And so I think that actually worked to my advantage. So yeah, just sort of following my intuition and never really second guessing, you know, but it's not, I didn't even have the opportunity to, so.
But I mean, and this becomes a tricky, like, how do we translate this into advice? Your intuition is really good. I've worked with lots of editors. This is a really good editor. You know, there was, we tell you the story of the fights, but there was lots of things that you would say, and it's that wonderful feeling when, you know, someone tells you you can cut something, and you're like, yes. And it's just sort of like the weight of those words is lifted away from you. And I think, I mean, we didn't have that many real sort of, we had sort of fights over what to do, but we didn't have any battles over, you know, this sentence versus that sentence. But that is also what you're looking for in a relationship with an editor, is where you can have this, we had lots of long conversations. You know, when you find someone that you can go back and forth with for 15 minutes about a comma, you're like, that's who you want to work with. And it's not every editor. Not every editor wants to do that. There's other philosophies of editing that are good as well. So I said, that's who you want to work with. That's who I want to work with. And I think that's that real sense of collaboration, that we are in this together. This is not really me versus you. Here we are both looking at this thing and trying to figure out how to talk about it.
And I was really fortunate because Jeff is so tuned into that collaborative process. So a lot of writers will, you know, craft a piece and not show you a single word of it until they have what they consider to be the perfect piece, and then everything after that becomes a battle. And with Jeff, he was so open, and he remains to be just so open about everything, every little step of the way, how to go reporting the story, how to structure it, how to write it, the tone of the piece, everything is a conversation, and Jeff's willing to talk through. And so I think that openness to collaboration is really what makes him such a great writer to work with.
So let's thank our guests here. We'll take a 5-minute break, and we'll be back here for the next session at 10 o'clock.